Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We're going to be trying something different today by doing a tier list. We know this is something other people have already done, but we thought it would be nice to at least try the concept ourselves and see if people like it.
It's just going to be the three of us here today, as while we like having been around, we wanted to keep it simple for our first video of this type.
As simple as you can get with Sonic fans when they can never agree on anything with this franchise.
As for the list itself, we have put several titles we haven't played in the bottom section. Some of them are copies of games that already have a spot, but since there isn't much of a way to distinguish them amongst the other ones, we will not be ranking them on the list, but we'll still talk about them later on. S is the top ranking, meaning it's the best, while F is the worst. The title's placement within the category itself will have no particular meaning either, so the ones on the left aren't necessarily better than the ones on the right.
I think the people watching this already have a decent idea on what a tier list is at this point, but let's actually start the list now if that's all right with everybody.
We're starting off with the classic that started it all, Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis. This was truly a classic and made a great alternative to Mario, who went way more slowly by comparison. For once, Nintendo had some competition in the market, and while I wouldn't say it's perfect, I think we should put it in A.
I'm going for D tier all the way.
Oh no, here we go.
Joe, I know you like the classic since you were probably 70 or something when it came out, but this is simply not as good as you say it is. Marble Zone is somehow slower than you, and aside from Green Hill and maybe Starlight Zones, there's just so much waiting in each level that it doesn't feel any different than a standard platformer. That and Labyrinth Zone is hated by everyone with a working brain, so I can see why you like the game so much.
Shut up, Orange Man. The only reason why you don't like this game is because Dr. Eggman is the same weight as you.
Fake news, old man.
Sure, some of the zones are a little slow, but even then, that just gives a good enough time to listen through the great music this game has.
If I wanted to listen to the music, I'd just go on YouTube and listen to it. That way I don't have to be bored senseless playing most of the game. The bosses are really easy too for the most part, and I'll admit later ports with the spin dash and drop dash do make it a better experience, but that still doesn't save from this boring game.
Hey guys, calm down for a minute and we can figure something out. Personally, I do enjoy the game, although I'm not as big a fan of it as Joe is. I think we can probably compromise on this by giving it a B, since I can't defend the negative aspects of the game that Donald mentioned, but I don't think it's enough to put it all the way down into D tier.
I still think it's way too high for this game, but if we can move on, then fine.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay, good. I'm glad we got that resolved relatively calmly. Let's move on to Sonic 2, which I think deserves an A tier.
S tier is much more appropriate.
C tier all the way.
Are we seriously doing this again?
Ain't no way Demented Donald is putting this masterpiece in C tier. Everybody knows this is an improvement on the first game, and while the original is more iconic, this brought so much new to the table. The inclusion of the spin dash for progression, much more involved in varied boss fights, Supersonic, Tails, Mechasonic, and the Death Egg are all fantastic additions which make it superior to the first game and most others in the series.
The only thing you're right about is that it's better than the first game and Supersonic, but that's it. I noticed you didn't mention the levels, which are mostly pretty boring. Emerald Hill and Chemical Plant are great, but the game tanks after that. Nobody liked Metropolis Zone, Sky Chase Oil Ocean, and Mystic Cave. Plus, the Death Egg is clearly a Star Wars ripoff, but somehow nobody here minds that it's completely unoriginal.
All right, fine, not every zone is a hit, but most of them are at least pretty good at worst, so I'm not sure if this is fair.
The levels are the main thing in the game, so I don't think it's unfair to judge most of it based on what the game is being played through. I haven't even gotten to the abysmal special stages and useless multiplayer. The actual mode is squished and boring, but the main game just has player 2 controls Tails, but if he goes off screen, then there's nothing you can do but wait for him to come back.
Okay, I'll agree that there are a few levels that aren't as fun, but I don't think that should be enough to bring the game down by that much.
All right, how about this? We'll keep this one in B tier as well, but Donald, you better be willing to compromise more when it comes to later entries, since this is a lot further down than what Joe would rank it.
Okay, I suppose that's fair.
Way too low, but fine. Let's move on.
All right, the next one is Sonic CD for the Sega CD, and I think we should put this one into C tier.
For once, I'm going to actually agree with you and say C tier is a good option.
I was thinking A tier myself. This was definitely an interesting game when it came out, as there's only a few games worth getting on the system, and it had a lot of interesting design choices. Sonic has the super peel out and has time travel in the game, which determines the state of the future. Not getting all of the robot generators in each level, or at least all of the time stones, mean the little planet has a bad future. It has two great soundtracks, but some of the boss fights aren't very interesting or just aren't well designed, like the one where you're running on a conveyor belt or the one where you have to navigate a pinball board.
That all makes sense to me, though I don't think it's as good since the levels are all designed with no coherency, since there's just so many things bouncing you around or blocking your progress in a way that feels very unnatural. That and the time travel, aside from changing the level design a bit, the colors don't really have a positive effect on you actually playing the game. Plus, the super peel out leaves you vulnerable to enemy attacks, and even if you go into a ball right after that, just means they should have just used the spin dash instead.
Yeah, Donald's actually right for once on this one. I think it's way too confusing, especially from that one level where it bounces Sonic up when I hit the ground. It makes me go, oh my Slimmy, it's that bad.
Okay, I don't know what an oh my Slimmy actually means, but I'm glad you two are agreeing on something for once, so I'm just going to let the game go into C tier, even though I think the game deserves better.
Sounds good. Now let's move on to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which I and everybody else believes should be an S tier.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Well, at least we all know where it's going, but let's talk about it at least a little bit before moving on. This game is fantastic in how it plays, with Sonic having the spin dash from Sonic 2, but also the insta-shield, which lets him attack enemies in a new way that hasn't been done before, or even since that I can think of. Since this is technically 2 games in one, there are a lot of levels to explore, and graphically it's the best of the games released so far.
The way characters get the Chaos Emeralds is great as you unlock Super Sonic by going through Blue Sphere, which is more explorative and fun than the half-pipe from before, and Hypersonic in the Sonic and Knuckles portion of the game. It's a great way to expand on Super Sonic's power. Plus you can play as Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, which is great to have so much variety in how you play the game since there's new paths depending on who you play as.
These levels are so much better than the other games. The only one I don't think is well designed would be Sandopolis, but I don't think it's so bad as to take the game that much lower. The soundtrack is great though. Admittedly, later ports of the game tend to use different music than the original, which is a shame, but nothing that makes or breaks the game.
I don't think this is my favorite game in the series exactly, but I think it's still worthy of S tier, and I'm glad we can all agree for once.
Well said, and while we're done with the mainline games on the Sega Genesis and CD, there's also Sonic 3D Blast, which, depending on how you think of it, is the first 3D game in the series, although it's hard to say due to it being an isometric viewpoint. I haven't actually played this one all that much, so I don't think I can really judge it. I'll just let you two take care of this one.
F tier.
C tier.
Joe, how do you believe this deserves anything besides failure across the board? This whole game is just a fetch quest where you're trying to collect birds while having no idea where to go. If you get hit, the birds fly around and you have to collect them all again, which nobody likes, and there's nothing in this game worth having except the homing attack, and even that was improved on in Sonic Adventure.
You just keep looking at all the negatives since you can't enjoy a good game if it's a little different than the other ones in the series. I'll admit this isn't a great game, but the worlds are fun and interesting to look at, while the soundtrack is once again top-notch quality. I'm not going to act like I come back to this game often or that it's as good as any of the other games so far, but it's not that bad either.
You hear that everyone, Joe, really likes this game where Tails and Knuckles stand and watch you put away all the birds while charging him to play boring special stages. You can't even access the last level without the Chaos Emeralds. I know it was like that in Sonic 3 and Knuckles 2, but those special stages and the rest of the game was actually fun, unlike this failure.
All right, guys, how about we put it into D tier, since I don't really have a stake in this and it's in between your choices.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
That's all right. I don't care enough about this game to argue about it.
Okay, D tier it is then. Now we're going on to some of the games not played as often, with Sonic 1 on the Game Gear.
Yeah, I remember playing this a long time ago. Back when Sonic Mega Collection Plus came out, I was playing the games on there constantly, mainly this one. I'll say it wasn't as good as the Sega Genesis version though, since I don't remember a lot of the game's levels as they didn't stand out, but I think it was good enough at what it did, so I'll say B tier.
To be fair to the game, Joe, you not remembering it says more about you than it does the game. Anyways, I remember playing this on the Sonic Adventure DX port for the GameCube, as you could unlock the Game Gear games there. Honestly, I don't really like this game all that much, so I put it in C tier. The auto-scrolling levels really don't make you feel faster since it limits your speed, and the rest of the zones are different enough from the original to be admirable, though don't really add anything better than the original version.
I'm agreeing with Barack here. There just isn't much in this game that I couldn't get in the other games, even the first one, despite me not liking it that much. I will say I like it better than that one, though that doesn't mean I think it's good. Plus, the Game Gear version has screen crunch issues, and that makes it worse than the Master System version. Normally, I think we should rank the Master System as the basis, but Sega keeps re-releasing the Game Gear version for some reason. I say we go with C and move on to something better.
All right, I'll accept that fine enough. Next up is Sonic 2 on Game Gear.
I said we should move on to something better, not worse, F tier.
Hold up, Donald, just because you can't get past that paragliding section doesn't mean this is a bad game. I don't think this game is great. In fact, I think it's actually kind of bad, but F is too low. This game did actually make the first appearance of Tails, though isn't great in the fact that you can't actually play as him. Plus, if you don't get the Chaos Emeralds, you can just let Tails die, which is weirdly saddening for this kind of game.
Are you seriously trying to defend this garbage? The first area has Dr. Zero IQ save Sonic just to put him in another trap instead of letting him die from an otherwise instant kill situation. That, and even if the game lets you play the later levels, the later bosses and zones are really difficult and not worth going through. The only reason I'll let this game go up to D tier is because Tails can die in the game, and I hate that two-tailed rat, so it has one redeeming quality.
This game has nothing good that the Sega Genesis version had, so I think D tier is appropriate.
That sounds good. Up next is Sonic Triple Trouble for the Game Gear. It's interesting as it introduces a new character, Fang the Weasel, as he will appear later on in Sonic the Fighters and Sonic Superstars, though they aren't on this list. It did have some unique zones that stood out amongst the others released at the time and is worth people's time. I don't think it's so great to deserve an A or S slot, but I think B or C is good.
This is not all that remarkable to me, but visually it's pretty good for the system, and it isn't as bad as some of the others on this list should be at, so I'll say C.
Yeah, I don't have much to say about this one. I used to play it a lot on the Nintendo 3DS when it was out, but now I don't really care about it, though I can't say there's much bad either. That train sequence in the snow level stood out, but other than that, I've got nothing.
Okay, we'll go with C since I don't have anything more to say about this one. How about we just go to Sonic Chaos since that's next? I'd actually go as far to say it's a B tier. It's pretty simple but fun as you can play as Sonic and Tails where they have their own unique abilities that make them stand out.
Now I'd go to say D or F. There's nothing great about this game, and it's so easy even Joe could beat it without difficulty, which is probably why it's likely going to be one of his favorites.
Fake news.
Sonic gets this spring and Tails can fly at 1 mile per year, but I wouldn't say that makes it a fun experience. I always look for things that stand out amongst other games, and this has nothing that the other games before and after don't already provide.
Okay, yeah, it is one of my favorites on the system, but that's not because it's easy. I don't just go looking at the negatives at everything just because they don't stick out as much as your painted on orange face does.
I'll have you know that my orange face is constantly complimented by people. I have people all the time telling me, wow, Donald, your orange face is so beautiful. How did you get it like that? And then I'll tell them with a lot of hard work, your face can become the same color.
Oh, really? Do you have to get a small loan of $1 million or get a spot on The Apprentice first? Is that what you mean by hard work? How does that even happen?
Can you two focus back up on the game? Please, it would be nice if our first tier list together didn't cause our friendship to end.
There's not much else to talk about, so I'm fine with whatever placement you want to do.
Okay, fine, I'll just put it in C tier then, that sounds about right.
Sonic Blast is up now, and I have to say it. Straight up F tier sounds good. This is almost like if the people that made the graphics for Donkey Kong Country decided to make sprites for this game, except make them all worse and put Knuckles in for no reason. The special stages have a really weird depth perception issue, and the regular stages are completely worthless to talk about.
That actually sounds okay. I'd say maybe D tier is better since I don't think the graphics are quite that bad, and some of the stages have unique elements like that desert and water level having different ways of getting around, but they aren't all that great anyway. If you want to put it in F tier, I won't argue since this game isn't good at all though.
I think it's odd how this game looks, but I think that also causes it to stand out in its own weird way. But yeah, I can't argue with anything else. I'm okay with it being slightly higher than F, but really I'm not going to put much more thought into this.
I'm D tier. I don't want to think about this game any more than I already have. But here's a really bad one. Sonic Labyrinth, and this one truly is F tier. I don't want to hear anything else. Dr. Eggman breaks into Sonic's house, and instead of killing his enemy, he just takes off his shoes and replaces them with shoes that make him walk really slowly, so you have to spin dash everywhere. This is Sonic 3D Blast, but without the jumping, and is even slower.
I agree this game has no place being anywhere else, and I hope we never get another re-release of this terrible game ever again.
Let's do F tier. I don't care about this game. Let's move on.
Oh boy, this is a really weird game that was coded while everybody was on bath salts. It's Sonic R for the Sega Saturn, but let's be real, we all played this on Sonic Gems Collection when it came out because nobody owned a Sega Saturn. This isn't a good game necessarily because of how overpowered some of the characters are, so there isn't much competition, and there being so few stages. I'd say D tier is best.
Yeah, I remember playing this with the kids and grandkids back in the day and having so much fun unlocking all the characters and getting Super Sonic even though he's so much better than the rest of the people in the game. I remember the first time I heard Can You Feel the Sunshine in Super Sonic Racing that I knew this was a game that would go down in history as one of the most unique kart racing experiences.
Joe, even though it is funny to look back on, objectively it has less content than most other racing games, especially the other Sonic ones, even though they're absent from this list. The songs are really unfitting, but are probably the most memorable part of the game, which isn't really a good thing. I get that you like it, but I think Donald is right in putting it into D tier.
Even though I don't agree with it, I know we were pretty understanding with ranking the games he didn't like earlier higher up, so I suppose I can live with that. What are we up to rank now?
Well, the list doesn't have some of the Game Gear and Genesis games, so we're skipping over Sonic Spinball, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, and the Drift games, but I don't think we would have much to talk about there, especially with more obscure ones like Sonic Schoolhouse.
Fun fact about myself, Sonic Schoolhouse was what finally taught me how to read since I just couldn't figure it out before.
Joe, you were nearly 54 when the game came out.
And let me tell you, I was nearly 58 by the time I was done with the game.
I don't want to think about the implications of that any more than I have to, so now we're into the real fun part. The beginning of the true 3D games in the series with Sonic Adventure, so this can only go well.
This is probably going to need a little bit more thought put into it than most of the other games. Sonic Adventure is a classic that still is regarded as a great game later today. It has 6 playable characters that have their own unique gameplay styles, although arguably only 3 or 4 are really good. You have Sonic, which is the best way to play the game since he has the most stages, and spin dash jumping is so useful for exploring the levels and finding shortcuts that couldn't be done in a 2D space. I know I'm going to need to explain it more, but I'm willing to go to C tier for this.
I was inclined to go all the way to S to this, but why would you go for C when you seem to be speaking of it positively?
Well, it is a fairly good game, and the parts that are great stand out. Although there is a lot to this game that holds it back. Tails is the next character, and he just chases Sonic through the levels, and although it is quite fun to find new shortcuts that you couldn't take as Sonic, it involves skipping through most of the level, and at that point there's not much point to the level design if you're meant to just go through it without considering the smaller details. Knuckles is better since you're interacting with the levels in a different way by searching for pieces of the Master Emerald, but it's still pretty restrictive in level design as you have a much smaller part of the level compared to the other characters.
Barack, I have to say I'm siding with Donald here. I like the game a bit more than he does, but I can see why he doesn't like it. After those 3 are Amy Rose, who first appeared in Sonic CD, though we forgot to talk about her as she appears like twice and doesn't do anything. She is really slow, and aside from attacking with her hammer, there isn't anything she can really do. Gamma's pretty fun and takes a new approach to the areas he goes through by shooting targets and enemies to increase the timer. It's held back by the fact that the boss fights are easy since you just press the shoot button, and I don't think there's an explanation on why there's a timer at all.
And don't even get me started on Big the Cat, since he just fishes for his frog the whole game and has absolutely no business being here, but you need to play as him to get to the last story segment. I'll admit the supersonic fight against Perfect Chaos is great, and Open Your Heart is easily one of the best songs in the series, but they stop the music halfway through and loses a lot of the impact.
In fact, I don't think there's any good boss fights in the game. All of Gamma's are just shooting a target on a mostly still robot. The Chaos fights are really repetitive, and you have to go through some of them more than once despite not changing their strategies. The character fights against each other are laughably simple and pose no threat.
Okay, I get it. You too, Donald. You don't like Big's story as he reminds you of your weight, and Joe,
Fake
you don't
news.
like the fights because only needing one input to win is still too much for your small brain to handle.
Fake news.
Sure, the fights aren't great, but they're not a major part of the game, so it's not like that 10 or so minutes altogether is enough to bring the game down by that much. Besides, there's still so much more to the game that you can go through that's actually fun and makes this game goated. In the DX Director's Cut version on the GameCube, you can get Game Gear games by getting emblems in Mission Finish. It does disappoint me that the more recent releases don't include the extra games, but it's not a huge loss, as our list has already indicated.
Oh, okay, fine. Let's talk about the emblems and missions. The emblems are done by repeating the levels, but for some reason they borrowed the bath salts the Sonic R team was using and made it so you can only accomplish one goal at a time. For example, if you finish the first stage with at least 100 rings and under the time limit, that doesn't matter, as you have to play it 3 times at a minimum anyway, since it doesn't count more than one objective at once. The ones around the hub worlds are fine enough and encourage exploration, so it's not that bad at least.
Those missions aren't all that great either. Instead of just having a menu where you select the mission and just do a task, you have to manually collect each card in order to have the right to play the mission, and it may not even be nearby. Plus, you can only find the card for the character you're playing, so if you're Sonic and are in Station Square, you can only pick up a card that is for a Sonic mission, and the other character ones just won't show up. And some of them are as bad as that sea salt ice cream flavored popsicle I had this morning, namely the ones in Ice Cap, where Tails has to collect the flags and Sonic has to make that really precise jump in the air.
All right, those 2 missions are really bad for sure, but you want to know what isn't. The fact that the missions are completely optional. What is fun is the Chow Garden, where you can give them animals and train them like an animal to do races, and that will grant you emblems. I can't tell you how much time I've spent training those guys and blowing away the competition with the stats, all at level 99.
You know what, Barack? You've convinced me.
I knew it was only a matter of time.
You've convinced me that once I start up this game, next time I'm throwing the egg at a wall and naming it Barack to show how little I care about the Chow Garden.
How about I bring my KO over to yours and they can fight it out?
Only because I know you'll have a disadvantage in the swimming game.
Can you explain exactly what you mean by that in great detail?
I can, but I'm getting the idea that I probably shouldn't.
I think we should mention what the reward even is. For getting all of the emblems, you just get Metal Sonic, and he's just a reskin of Sonic and goes through the same levels with his own repetitive missions. I guess there's a few achievements to it, but I don't know if that's really worth it.
Actually, I think we forgot to mention him in the Sonic CD discussion now that I think about it. But more importantly is the soundtrack to the game, which is still one of, if not the best in the franchise, and that can't really be disputed, even if it has competition.
Okay, I'll give you that, but I think we should read up on some of the lyrics for Amy's song, as it's bizarre any of this made it through. I do understand the feelings of a Persian cat, but the Sphinx looks so cute I had to shave it. He reminds me of Parsley when he's standing there alone. Makes me want to be his specialty. I guess I'm just a self-centered girl, MMM. But there are nights that I have trouble going to sleep, aha. I wouldn't be surprised if they brought on Joe to write this, since it's unbelievable how this was a song they thought was acceptable for this or any game.
All right, I can't defend that one.
Guys, I think we need to talk about the actual stages in Hub World, since there's quite a lot to talk about. There's new locations, specifically Station Square, the Mystic Ruins of Jungle, and the Egg Carrier. These are important to go through, as you have to find the stages to progress in the story. Honestly, I don't care for these all that much, but they do look a lot more realistic than most of the other parts of the game, except for that hamburger guy who you can effortlessly pick up for some reason.
Are you kidding me, Joe? The hub worlds are great and make the game feel like there's some coherency to it. Even the previous games are kind of unclear how they're all in the same general vicinity when their environment is so different, but here it's obvious how each one connects and feels less like a game, if that makes sense. Plus, there's so many great stages like Emerald Coast Speed Highway Casinopolis Ice Cap, and even more that keep you playing just because of how much there is to do in each one.
Oh yeah, I sure love flying in the tornado 4 times because it was so fun when I started that I just needed to go through it 3 more times for good measure. I will say some of the stages are pretty fun when you're going through them with a fast character, but pretty much none of them are fun with Amy and Big. Plus, there's just the ones that aren't fun with anybody, like Hot Shelter Sky Deck and the Lost World, and yet somehow it's still better than the actual Sonic Lost World.
Okay, you're right about Sonic Lost World and the stage being bad, but I don't think it's bad enough to bring down the whole game by several tiers.
Barack, if it were all that, then I think I would still say it's an A or B tier, but what really brings it down for me is that there's a lot of glitches throughout the game, especially on later releases. The camera is really not good a lot of the time, but that's not comparable to the parts where Sonic will just go through a loop without meaning to and die in Emerald Coast or just get stuck on some level of geometry. I didn't play much of the Dreamcast version since it was mainly on the GameCube or the HD releases, which made some things worse.
Yeah, I was about to mention the later versions. I wasn't a big fan of the changes visually when it was released on the GameCube, but having the Game Gear games at least gave something fun to unlock regardless of their quality. Meanwhile, the HD versions take those away and makes the game even shinier than it already was. I feel like I can see my reflection in half the game, and I can't say it made the experience any better.
If that's the main reason why you don't like the game so much, I can at least see why you think so. I do agree the later version have their own merit, but the HD version is strangely the most recent way you can play it, which is pretty strange. If you want to put the game into something like B tier, then I think that is an acceptable compromise.
I do see why you like the game so much, and I do think it probably was one of the best Sonic games when it came out and still isn't bad. It's just there's a lot holding it back depending on how you're playing it, but there's still things wrong regardless of what option you choose.
I can live with a B tier. I'm glad we at least made it through the whole discussion for that game without mentioning Sonic Adventure 2 and making constant comparisons. Speaking of the game, it's the next one up to talk about.
Personally, I think that this is a much better game than the first, so I'll say S tier.
I definitely enjoyed this game quite a bit more, so I'll go with A or S tier since it wasn't perfect, but still had a lot more going for it than the first Sonic Adventure game.
This is a solid C tier for sure.
You have to be pranking us, Barack. You seriously put this game so low, and yet the first Sonic Adventure is like the greatest game you've ever played. This is so much better, and you know it. For the viewers that aren't as familiar, there are 3 story sections this time, though there's 3 total gameplay styles that you'll encounter in all of them. There's the hero side story where you can play as Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, but there's also the dark side story with Dr. Eggman plus 2 new characters with Rouge the Bat and Shadow the Hedgehog.
And let me tell you, a lot of that isn't fun at all. Sonic and Shadow have a lot more speed, and they have just about the same amount of levels that Sonic already had in the first game, and they're not as fun in general. There are some good ones like Rail Canyon City Escape and Metal Harbor, but at the same time there's the space levels, which are bad all across the board in this game. Plus the treasure hunting levels with Rouge and Knuckles are way worse since the radar for the Emerald only shows 1 at a time, so even if you're right next to 1, if the radar isn't searching for it, then there's no way of knowing. Sure, you can still pick it up, but the game won't help you like it did before.
I don't know if it's fair to compare it to the first game so much. Sure, the speed levels are different and more linear than the first game, but all of the stages are different to each character, which means you don't have to accommodate for so many characters to go through the same sections. I will agree the radar is worse than the original game, but the levels are easy enough to travel to most of the time, so it wouldn't take that long to travel through.
In Barack's defense, the treasure hunting levels aren't as easy, though that doesn't mean they're inherently bad. And a few levels just straight up aren't good, like Meteor Herd Death Chamber and Mad Space. There's no way I can defend those, but I do think having levels only done by one character is great for focusing on their play styles more extensively.
Thank you, Donald. I'm glad at least one of you is being reasonable about this. I haven't even mentioned the shooting levels either. Someone decided what Sonic really needed was slow mechs, where shooting was the main goal instead of speed. Better yet, Tails is stuck shooting the whole time when both his vehicle and he are clearly capable of flight, but just decides not to. I do think a lot of the upgrades the characters get in this game are pretty good, as it makes the levels a lot more bearable. The bounce bracelet for Sonic is great, but since Shadow doesn't get that he's just inherently worse. Same with Dr. Eggman getting an armor upgrade that Tails won't use. Don't even tell me either of you used the Magic Hands too, or the Mystic Melody, unless it was absolutely essential.
Okay, yes, some of those aren't fun, but some characters not having upgrades isn't that big a deal. They weren't so important that it makes it less fun. But what really makes the levels really fun is going back through them to achieve the A ranks. There are 5 missions to each level, and they all make it more fun to go through and master your skills.
I have to disagree a little bit on that one, Joe. This does have the same problem where you can't achieve more than one goal, but to be fair to this game, the goals are different enough to warrant multiple playthroughs, like looking through a lost Chow or doing a hard version of the stage. I will say the 4th mission isn't needed, as it's just going through the level without dying, which is what you're already doing for the first time through, so it doesn't add much of value.
I suppose it does add a lot of replay value, though I think some of the Sonic and Shadow levels are a little too difficult, especially at the end. But don't even get me started on Mission Street with Tails trying to collect 100 rings. You have to play most of the level, and making one mistake means doing the same boring stage again. It is kind of nice on the treasure hunting stages having all the pieces in the same spot for the hard mode level, but otherwise I don't really care for it. Thankfully, one of the only things this game does better is the Chow Garden, where there's even more to do, like make them fight each other and go through obstacle courses. I've spent dozens of hours playing this worst game just to train up those little guys.
I don't care how good the game is, I'll still never care about these little blue freaks.
We haven't even talked about the last story segment, which has the characters come together to defeat the Bio-Lizard and then save the world from the Space Colony Ark. It's an amazing final battle which plays one of the best songs with Live and Learn through the background.
Okay, that's a weird way to say the song name, but you're right in that it is a great ending to an otherwise inferior game, but I think we should give some background on this. Basically, Sonic gets arrested because he was accused of being a black hedgehog, which I didn't appreciate, so Amy breaks him out of jail. Knuckles breaks the Master Emerald because Dr. Fatso is stealing it yet again. Shadow is a new hedgehog who is allegedly the ultimate life form, despite the previous attempt being this giant lizard that he ends up fighting. He's a loser and couldn't save Eggman's cousin Maria from getting shot by the gun agents on the Ark.
I suppose that does sum up most of the game, but they also get the moon blown up, which doesn't really bother anyone. Eventually, the Bio-Lizard is going to destroy the world, so Sonic and Shadow go into super forms, but Shadow falls to the earth and presumably dies, although he gets brought back in later games, so it kind of lessens the impact a little bit.
I don't really think we play Sonic games for the story anyway, but I figured we could at least bring it up though, now that I think about it. I don't think we really did for the other games. For whatever reason, the designers put in these chase sequences where Rouge and Tails go across these highways chasing something, but the controls are very stiff and isn't all that fun. Plus, those extra missions require you to do really specific things like not hit cars or walls, which can be really difficult. I guess there's also a boss rush, but it's not required unless you're going for every emblem.
Yeah, there are some things that aren't necessary, like the boss rush and driving levels, but they weren't that bad. If that wasn't enough, there's also the multiplayer, which is an amazing experience. I've been playing all the stages with Kamala recently, and it's been such a nice time getting through the different arrangements of previous stages. Definitely one of the best multiplayer experiences in the series.
That's not really saying a lot when the multiplayer up to this point has been Tails going off screen in Sonic 2, all the Game Gear games that nobody played alone, much less with other people, and the racing game with no balance between players. It's fine, but it's not something that saves the game or anything. I did also want to acknowledge the updated versions since those have their own problems. They aren't as bad as the original Sonic Adventure re-releases, but they still need some work. I did like the better screen resolution for the HD version, though the sound is even less balanced than Joe after trying to climb the stairs at Air Force One. We all know the I found you faker lines where they're just interrupting each other.
I'm definitely on Barack's side when it comes to the Air Force One moment, but what's even worse is the HD versions have you pay extra for the DLC, which isn't helpful for the player, though I think they did the same with the other Sonic Adventure game. I just forgot to bring it up. I do think the conversion was done better, but still left a lot to be desired in some ways. Like, who cares about the leaderboards in-game? Let's be real. I think the last really important detail we should mention is actually getting all the emblems. There's 180 in total, and getting all of them for each character gets you new outfits in the racing mode, but also a 3D remake of Green Hill Zone Act 1. I don't like how often it comes up, but this is better since you're going through it a different way.
Fine Green Hill Zone was pretty fun to unlock, but I much rather get the Game Gear games as those have more content than Green Hill Zone, especially as it just takes much less time to unlock everything. For as bad as some of the missions in the first adventure game were, it was pretty quick getting most of them and took about 10 hours less time than completing everything in Sonic Adventure 2.
And it would have taken even less times if the emblems stacked and the missions were just from a menu system instead of collecting all of them manually.
I think we can all agree that both games have a lot of improvements that weren't fully addressed and likely won't ever get fixed. Joe, I do think going through the original Sonic Adventure game has an arguably better reward on the GameCube version, specifically as even if we didn't like the Game Gear games all that much, I'm sure others will like them more.
I guess that's a fair assessment.
And Barack, I do think Sonic Adventure 2 does have a better overall experience, even with getting everything, as all the weird level geometry glitches just aren't so common as they were in the first game, along with each level being a more focused experience for the character going through it. I know there's other things like the boss fights here that we didn't cover, but even those have a higher overall level of quality, even if some of them aren't great. It's the fact that the lowest points of this game are mostly higher than they were in the original Sonic Adventure. I don't imagine you're willing to put this in S tier, as even I don't know if I'd set it there, but are you willing to at least put it in A based on our discussion?
Yeah, I think that's fine. It's still a little higher than I would put it, but you two did make some good points that I can't argue, and what you said was very profound. I'll always want these games to both be remade with a better experience that cuts out the unnecessary parts, but I'm fine with what we have, and that's what matters most.
On one hand, I'm glad we were able to get this game ranked after a while, but how is it that we still have 13 more games to talk about, and we're nearly half an hour in already?
Sonic games will do that to you. Up next, we have Sonic Heroes, which was notable for being the first Sonic game to be released on multiple platforms that weren't originally released on a Sega console, if I'm not mistaken. I think we should put this game in D tier, and that's being generous.
Oh man, I was hoping you'd be on my side for this one too, because I think a B tier would be better suited for a game like this.
Donald, I'm glad we're finally agreeing on this, since I think this deserves an F tier personally, but I suppose I could go with D if it comes down to it.
The game first started having problems when I learned the game was split up into 4 teams where they all go through the same level, so you just have to play them multiple times to actually finish the game. I wouldn't mind so much if the levels were vastly different, but it's basically just going through the levels with Team Sonic normally, then a shortened, easier version with Team Rose. Then Team Dark goes through all of it and even more, but lastly has Team Chaotix hunt for things with absolute precision, otherwise you have to play the stage all over again.
I do realize some of it is similar to the structure of Sonic Adventure, with going through the levels more than once, but at least there you were doing different things. Sonic ran through stages like he usually does. Tails flew around looking for shortcuts. Knuckles had Emerald Piece searching. Even the less fun characters like Amy and Big at least had new areas of levels like Hot Shelter to not make it as boring regardless of their actual quality. Here there's just so little variation aside from length that it feels like padding to make the game artificially longer.
Okay guys, let's not go too hard on the game. I think we can mention some of the positives. Sure, going through the same parts of levels so many times is a little much, but they're still pretty fun and look amazing for a game that had to be developed for multiple systems. Honestly, I don't think Team Rose and Dark were quite as good, but Team Chaotix at least made me think about the levels in a different way than I did before and was worth having. Even then, I do agree needing to find so many things in levels like those fire torches in the castle level was too excessive.
I was about to mention how bad some of those Chaotix levels were, but I'm glad you brought that up. I could never get past it for the longest time. The only things keeping this game out of F tier for me are the graphics, and the music is generally really good. Unfortunately, everything else is brought down by the control of the game. Everyone here is so slippery, and you're always at risk of falling everywhere you go. I don't think there's any stage in the game that makes you really feel like you're safe just because I can't possibly get the characters where they need to be without sliding everywhere else first.
All right, I can't argue with that one. I didn't have quite the same issues you did, but yeah, that is a major point against the game here. I wish they would have changed the characters to be a lot slower, actually, so you could be more precise, or at least have the levels be harder to fall off of. It does hamper the experience, and that's a big reason why I'm not putting it higher up.
I'm willing to put this game into F tier because of the controls mainly, though even the good parts like the soundtrack can just be listened to online without the game. I also really don't like most of the levels because they tend to do something I really don't like, such as the frogs in the forest messing with the stage or the rails being hard to navigate, without falling off the stage entirely. The castle area was pretty weird to get around too, but what really got me was the casino levels where you can barely control anyone as you're often stuck going one direction on those pinball parts, and I still have no clue how you're supposed to enjoy them.
Probably the absolute worst part of the game is getting the Chaos Emerald. I swear this is the Joe Biden of special stages. The lowest point of the game for sure is the game just decides at pure random if your input will actually make anybody go the place you want them to. Sometimes you're holding one direction and the game will disobey and keep you in the same place, or the opposite will happen.
Joe, can you remind us why you like this game again? Because we really aren't seeing much so far that could be considered quality.
I like this game more than you two do because it brought something new to the series and how it handled characters cooperating with each other. I know the controls in general could use some work, but having the speed flight and power formations makes you think differently on how you approach situations as in the other games. Before you only had what your specific character you can do, though now you have 3 options a lot of the time. I get why you two don't like this game so much, but for me it brought a new experience than the others that came before and after, plus it opened the audience to the Xbox and PlayStation crowd when they got the game.
I guess that makes sense to you, but we just aren't seeing it the same way. Even the little things like Team Sonic abandoning their plane when they read the hologram paper when they could have just used it to fly to their next destination shows a lack of polish for things like the story, in which there's barely any. The motivations for the characters range from Stop Dr. Eggman to wanting to get money. Even Team Dark had something interesting with reviving Shadow, but nothing really comes of it here. Seeing Metal Sonic as the main enemy for a lot of the game was interesting, and his fight was good when you listen to what I'm made of, though I just didn't care for it.
And speaking of Metal Sonic, the boss fights were downright laughable. It was either fighting a giant creation of Dr. Eggman that just ran around until you caught up to him, a lot of smaller enemies in rounds, or just spamming the tornado move to knock out the other main characters. Sorry if it seems we're just hating on a game that you like, but Donald and I think there's too much holding this game back to enjoy it. I am going to be incredibly generous now and offer a C ranking, even though I think it's way too high personally, as I don't want this to be down too far for you as you like the game, but I can't go any higher.
I guess that will work. I don't think I can convince either of you to put it higher, and I think what you said did make sense, especially about the controls being such a deal breaker. We can put it in C to move on to something hopefully better.
And speaking of better, next up is Sonic the Hedgehog for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, often known as Sonic 06 by the fans.
Hey guys, I know this game has a bad reputation, but I don't think it's quite as bad as a lot of people are saying it is. I'd say maybe a C or B tier would be good.
Joe, are you taking that white stuff from Hunter's Supply that he always has with him, since this game deserves straight up F tier, no question?
Hold on, Donald. I think this is worth discussing a little bit more detail than just failing the game at the very beginning of us talking about it. Most of the game's worst traits are the fact that the story and gameplay are very unrefined or just not finished at all. I am aware there's a Project 06 release that fixes a lot of problems with the game, but we're not considering that when it comes to our thoughts.
Okay, fine. I'll give you every reason why this is such a terrible piece of garbage that deserves F. The story is awful for so many different reasons it's hard to sum up. Sonic keeps saving Princess Elise from Dr. Rofatnik, and that's pretty much it. I know there's more to it, but that's the majority of what he does. Shadow, I barely even remember what happens for him, but I'm glad I don't remember so I don't have to be burdened by the memory of this game any more than I have to. Silver is the new character, and his journey makes him go through different times, which admittedly is more interesting than the other characters, but it doesn't make sense how he's with Blaze the cat, who is established as being from an alternate dimension instead of the future.
I guess we should have ranked Sonic Rush before this, since it doesn't make sense to those who are unfamiliar with this series already.
Hey, if the game doesn't care about our continuity, then why should I? Anyway, everyone just kind of fights each other while eventually getting the Chaos Emeralds, and Shadow fights this other new hedgehog called Mephill. Basically, if Elise cries at all, she releases the Iblis trigger, which is a really weird prerequisite. Sonic gets killed by Mephill, which causes Elise to cry, and then the last story segment happens. Shadow never killed Mephill, despite his fights with him, and Silver realizes he shouldn't be trying to kill Sonic, so they all come together and save Sonic, but don't actually succeed until Elise, a human princess, kisses Sonic, which is one of, if not the most infamous parts of the whole franchise.
Guys, I have to be honest, I think about that kissing scene every time I play this game and always wish I was in Elise's place.
Joe, I could have gone my whole life without knowing that and would have been significantly happier. Anyways, Donald, you didn't even say the main villain's name correctly.
Well, I'm sorry I can't say it correctly with Play HT. It's not exactly easy to write out like other names here. Once Sonic turns into Super Sonic, him, Shadow, and Silver all fight Solaris, and when they win, the game just kind of resets and is as if it didn't happen, and yet I still have all of the terrible memories of this game. I get that it was trying to be an epic story about multiple stories having different events that line up like the other Sonic adventure games, but it's simply not as interesting for the most part, and the parts that are memorable are not memorable for good reasons. Though Shadow kicking Silver in slow motion was pretty good, I'll admit.
Joe, I think there are some redeeming qualities about this game, but I'll admit Donald is right about the story. Do you have any sort of insight that would prove him wrong at all?
Donald, I get why you think the story is bad, but it's actually pretty good when you think about it hard enough. Sonic and Elise's love story is amazing when you look past the fact that they're a human and animal pair. Everyone's journey through different times made for more variety in the areas the characters explored and left a lasting impression on me when I played this after it first came out. I still cry every time Blaze flies away and dies, which is a little bit lessened since she comes back in later games anyway.
Oh, so it's great if you disregard everything not great, I see. I imagine that's how many people rationalize their decision to vote for you, and they're probably the kind of people who like Sonic and Elise as a couple.
All right, Donald, you made your point quite well, and even though there are more plot details we could talk about, I don't think it's going to change anybody's minds if we did so. Joe, can you tell us something about the gameplay you like?
Oh yeah, I'm ready to do that all day long. I've got this. The Sonic portion of the game is really fun, where you have Sonic's main movement and abilities from the adventure games, but with other characters occasionally helping him with sections he couldn't otherwise pass through. It's a nice way of making the characters seem useful, that different enough from Sonic heroes to stand out. There's also the gems, which make it even more fun for Sonic to travel places in ways he never has before.
The only reason you like the gems is because they weren't even finished and they last infinitely when they shouldn't. It's also really weird to control Sonic when his movement is a lot more stilted than it was before, leading to a lot of mistakes that wouldn't happen with the other adventure game controls. Plus, don't even get me started on the Mach speed sections, which is Sonic tripping every other step and flying off course.
I think if Sonic's controls were tweaked a little bit and the Mach speed sections were easier to control, then this would be the most fun part of the game. It still kind of is, but could have been a lot better. Personally, I found Shadow's gameplay to be pretty fun, with his chaos powers being pretty fun and his breakdancing attacks were entertaining to watch. His vehicle sections certainly weren't good though, and his levels were fine enough.
Of course, Barack would like the style of the Black Hedgehog, no surprise there.
I'm
the
sorry,
alternate
what?
characters are all awful, with Tails having ring bombs that lag the game while Rouge and Knuckles get stuck on every wall they can, but the absolute worst is Silver's gameplay. The idea of a psychic hedgehog in the series is nice, but the execution is a lot to be desired, with him only interacting with select objects in the levels while being much less limited in the cutscenes to add insult to injury. Do I even need to mention the ball segment, or does mentioning that alone make my point?
All right, fine, I can't deny a lot of that, but once you actually know how to control the characters, it's way easier to play through than you're making it sound. Yes, a lot of it could have been used better, but what we had is still fun enough as it is.
Are you huffing gasoline, Joe? These characters are not fun to play as, and yet somehow they're even worse than I'm making it sound. I mentioned the vehicle sections, but how about the ones in Kingdom Valley where you just fly straight forward with no input and win? Or the part where buildings can just fall on you and you die with no time to react? Or where Sonic needs to carry Elise through the sand and not sink in it, because that's just how sand works in this world. The boss fights are bland too. Some of the Eggman ones aren't actually all that bad, but that's the best I can say about them. The Silver one is infamous for how easy it is to get stuck in an endless loop of it's no use. It's no use, it's no use, it's no use.
I can see what you mean, Donald, but I think some of them are fun in their own right and don't deserve to be called bad, like that dog boss fight in the Desert Coliseum area. And the Silver fight isn't even that bad if you listen for when he makes his attack, then slide into it. Even the final boss is pretty climactic, and Donald, will you please stop? That it's really annoying. You're just saying the same thing over and over. Is this how you are at your rallies? I can't imagine being in the room with you when you just say the same thing over and over again. I hope you forget how to talk after this, so I don't have to hear your overweight mouth again.
Oh, what's wrong, Barack? Are you getting angry I'm being as annoying as this game is? I think I've made my point well enough with that.
All right, that's enough, you two. We need to move on to something that won't get us fighting so much like the levels in this game. Not every character goes through every level, but I think each of them was nice to go through, and collecting those medals was fun to explore. The end of the world segment wasn't that great with the black holes, I'll admit, but I'm willing to accept it more since it's the last level of the game.
Sorry, Joe, but I can't exactly agree on this one. For me, a lot of the levels have something that makes it unenjoyable to look forward to. Donald already mentioned some of them, like the Mach speed sections and the silver ball puzzle, but there's also the snow section where the camera will abruptly change and give you no time to adjust and cause Sonic to go where he doesn't want to. The gems for Sonic make things easier, but since they weren't programmed correctly, it's still an example of bad game design. The main things I like about this game are the graphics are overall decent and a great soundtrack, plus some of the levels are fun once you're practiced enough, though that doesn't make it good by any means.
The soundtrack is good and the CGI quality of a few scenes are pretty good, but that doesn't redeem the other 98% of the game. And this doesn't exactly matter as much as everything else, but the way of getting to the levels is worse than before. The hub world of Solana is confusing to know where to go, and it's worse than both Sonic adventure games. At least Station Square and the other locations were easier to get around and had hints on where to go. Plus, all of the extra minigames don't add any value, especially when every other text box needs its own loading screen. That is an issue through the whole game, though it does let me check all of the reactions I get on Truth Social while it loads, so it's not all bad.
All right, I think I've heard enough now. There's no arguing this game is not well liked amongst the fan base, and even though I think it has a few good things about it that makes it worth the D tier. It had a lot of effort, and if it was finished, could have been a great time, but I think that's appropriate for us to place it. Donald, I know this is higher than you wanted, and Joe, this is lower than you wanted, but we need to compromise somewhere here.
I still think it's too high, but if this is the way we're going to move on to something better, then fine, I'll accept it.
Yeah, perhaps this game is a little worse than I thought after hearing what you two had to say. I still like it, but sure, D tier is fine.
Up next, we have Sonic Unleashed. This is definitely a more divisive game than Sonic 06 since there's the Warhog as a new gameplay style that hadn't been seen in the series. Personally, I would put it in A tier or even S tier myself.
Yeah, this was one of my favorites. I'd go for an A tier. That sounds good.
Hold up, guys. Let's not get too excited about this game yet. It's better than Sonic 06, I'll give you that. But that's not really saying much. I'd say closer to C tier is about right.
Well, at least you like the game a little bit based on your rankings, so hopefully this won't devolve into arguing so much. The story is less complicated than the previous one, so it's easier to follow, though I'm not sure how Dark Gaia didn't completely destroy all life on the planet since he broke it in so many different places.
And don't forget about Chip getting all of that ice cream. Sometimes I wish I was Chip since he likes ice cream almost as much as I do.
Yeah, we know, Joe, that isn't exactly news to any of us.
Yeah, the story is okay, but nothing amazing. It's more of Dr. Eggman trying to get this giant creature to take over the world like he has been for a while in these 3D games.
I like it for being relatively simple. Honestly, there isn't much I can really comment on since it isn't offensive enough to warrant an argument, but not great enough to being a determining factor in my opinion. What I think is really great about this that I enjoy so much is the gameplay, of course. Sonic has his boost, which allows him to go at great speeds, but not in a way that causes him to die a lot like the Mach speed sections. The levels are based on real-world locations, so they're very distinct compared to everything else in the series.
Yeah, that's all nice, but I really hate it when I want to do a homing attack and all of a sudden I'm boosting to my death since they're on the same button, as if they really didn't have that many options on the controller.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. It is pretty annoying when that happens.
I wonder what Professor Pickle's favorite ice cream flavor is.
What really gets me is unfortunately the Warhog section. For some reason, Sega decided what they needed was to have Sonic be way slower than he's ever been before and just beat up enemies. Granted, it's better than hitting enemies multiple times in Sonic Heroes, and it's not badly designed combat, but it's the fact that it really doesn't fit a Sonic game that well. Plus, most of the levels are way longer than they reasonably should be.
Come on, guys, the Warhog isn't that bad. Plus, the levels are split up into sections, so it takes a while to get through all of them, so you get breaks in between.
Wait a minute, Joe. That's not how it works. Are you talking about the Wii version?
Yeah, what else would I be talking about?
Joe, did you even know there's a PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 version?
Oh, no, I didn't know it came out there. That's news to me.
Do you see what we're dealing with here, Barack? He doesn't even know what version of the game we're talking about, and he's supposed to be leading the country.
To be fair, I don't think that's the best way of testing whether or not he is fit to be president.
Point being, he can't give his input on this. Anyway, if this were some side game or even just a different character that isn't Sonic, then I'd think it would be pretty good, but it's just not what I look for in a Sonic game.
That's actually quite reasonable, and I can't blame you for that. I'll admit it doesn't really fit very well, but it's fun for what it is. If there's anything that holds back the game for me, it's that the medals are required throughout the game to access later stages, and you have to get quite a lot of both Sun and Moon medals to finish the game. If you're already going for them, then it's not that big of a problem, but at the same time, it does hinder players who don't know where they are.
I was about to mention that, but even on my first playthrough, I only needed to look for a few of them, so it wasn't that bad for me.
Hey guys, what do you think Chip's favorite ice cream flavor is? I'm going to try meeting up with him if I can find him and compare what our favorites are.
Sorry, Joe, I don't know and also don't care, so I'm not of much help. I do actually like the hub world since they're more interesting than the other ones, and there are medals to collect that incentivize learning where things are. I think some levels are a little difficult to reach, but otherwise they're fine.
I know we're not ranking the Wii and PlayStation 2 version, but I think that one is fine. I didn't find it as fun since the graphics were way worse and there were no hub worlds to explore, but it was good enough.
I almost forgot to mention how Eggman Land is one of the worst levels in the series. It's way too long even for a gaming master like myself.
Yeah, even though I didn't have that much trouble, it could have been about a fifth of the length and would have been good.
Okay, I think sea salt ice cream is Chip's favorite. It just has to be. I'll see how it compares to the chocolate chip since that's my favorite.
That's great, Joe, but Donald, are you willing to settle in A tier at all?
It's a bit high for me, but if you're someone who actually likes the Warhog, then I can see why you would like it. Eggman Land is terrible as a final level for how overly long and difficult it is, but yeah, A tier is okay.
Very good. I'm glad we got through that one okay enough, even if Joe didn't even know which version of the game we were talking about for most of it.
Now we have Sonic Colors, which I'm not a huge fan of. I don't think it's terrible, but I'd say C tier.
Really, Joe, now there's finally the first mainly 2D console game in such a long time and you don't even like it? I'd say it's worthy of A tier for sure.
I was thinking around B, so this should be interesting.
So I don't hate this game or anything, but at the same time, I don't think it's really great either. If you thought the Sonic Unleashed story was simple, this one takes it down even further. It's obvious that Dr. Baldy McNosehair is going to be the bad guy, and just because he's gotten enough money to build an amusement park in space, that doesn't mean he's tricking anybody.
I really hope you know we're talking about the Wii version and not the DS version.
Yeah, I don't think any of us have played the DS version, so I don't know how that works. Anyway, there's not much to talk about with the story. I don't really like the Wisps all that much since they keep appearing in later games with no real reason behind them for the most part. They're fine in this game, but usually it's just to make a slightly different path going through the level.
Okay, yeah, they're not always necessary, but this game makes the perfect blend of 2D and 3D environments. It has a lot of the speed of the 3D games that the 2D games lacked, and yet it has the easy to jump into style of level design and controls that the 2D games were much better at.
I do agree with Donald in that it's easy to get into, but I also think Joe's right about the Wisps. I'm kind of indifferent to them and really don't see much value in them both in this game, but more so later ones. Here they are nice to use, but it's easy enough to progress without them.
I don't think it's all that great because there's not too much depth for me. I don't feel much reason to go back to the levels since a lot of them are too easy, and I don't find much value in the red rings or the simulator levels. Supersonic is nice, but it's not really worth it for me. I played it on the Wii and then I didn't feel a really lasting impression.
Wow, I can't believe something was too simple and easy for Joe. I'm pretty sure you struggled to understand Pong when it came out, so it's a surprise to me.
Joe, I think you're being a little too hard on the game. The levels for me were generally fun, and since a lot of it was in space or some other planetary environment, it was yet another fresh experience like Sonic Unleashed, was though these levels aren't based on real-world locations.
I think Joe was probably playing through half the game in his sleep. I guess the bosses weren't all that great and the S ranks weren't very fun at points, but otherwise I thought it was a solid experience except for that ultimate release. I didn't realize Sega could butcher such a great game like that, but they did.
Come on, it wasn't that bad. I liked the cosmetic options from what little I tried of that version. It wasn't as bad as the Game Boy Advance version of Sonic 1.
Oh, sure, you don't like the main game, and yet you think Sonic Colors Ultimate is worth defending. That's classic Joe for you.
Saying it's better than Sonic Genesis on the Game Boy Advance isn't really saying much. We can just meet in the middle and call it B tier so it's close to everyone's ranking.
Now, for yet another fantastic game, that being Sonic Generations, do we even need to say anything except for S tier?
I don't think we need to, but it would still be nice to go over why it's so great. It's very reliant on fan service, but in a way that feels respectful to the games where it's taking the inspiration from. Levels from various eras of the franchise are accounted for, and each of them has their own unique spin, no pun intended, on the original design.
I had way more fun in these stages than the original ones, especially the Sega Genesis ones. The classic Sonic segments are nice since the spin dash is so useful for getting high speeds better than he ever could before, and modern Sonic is a refinement of the 3D game design that some of the previous games struggled with.
Yeah, I think this is great and all, but I miss Chip. I can't think about any ice cream eating since he's not in the game.
That's fine, Joe. We can enjoy the game without eating ice cream. I suppose there are a few negatives, but I don't think there's enough to really hold the game back by that much. The time eater isn't all that important after the introduction scene, and it's not a fun boss fight at the end. The online rankings aren't that great, except you need them to get trophies or achievements from them. Some of the missions around the main levels aren't fun, but you only need a few of them to get through the main fights.
Speaking of that, I really enjoyed the boss fights too. The rival battles were way better than their original versions, especially Perfect Chaos and Metal Sonic. I didn't have as much fun with the Egg Dragoon and the Death Egg Robot, but they were at least distinct enough from the games they came from to not feel like rip-offs.
So wait a minute, you guys are talking about the HD versions, right? I only really remember a lot of the 3DS game.
Yes, Joe, we're talking about the HD version.
Oh, okay, good. From what I remember, I thought this was pretty fun. I played it on Steam, and I was disappointed that the Casino Night DLC was just a pinball machine, and that the original Sonic the Hedgehog game was only a bonus on the console versions for some weird reason.
Okay, yeah, that was really weird. I know we aren't ranking it on here now, but from what I've played on the 3DS version, it's recycling the original stage design for classic Sonic where it can, but to be fair, at least they have almost all different zones and fights than the original, so it's at least worth playing.
I think we can just put this into S tier and move on since we all seem to really like this game and the negatives aren't enough to take it down any lower. Plus, any game that makes a Sonic 06 level fun deserves S tier automatically. And since Sonic X Shadow Generations isn't out when we're ranking all of these games, we obviously can't rank that.
How about we go to a much different game, this time being Sonic and the Secret Rings? I don't think any of us have played Sonic and the Black Knight, so we won't be talking about that one at all.
I haven't played this one either since I knew about the motion controls being required and figured this wasn't the game for me.
Oh, does the idea of a game where you move around not sound appealing?
Nobody asked you, Joe, anyway. No, I just never found much interest in this because of the controls and because I didn't think the storybook idea really fit the series, so that's why I didn't play this.
So I may be in the minority, but I think this game is actually pretty good. This has Sonic appear in the Arabian Nights world, and other characters that are normally associated as Sonic characters have similar roles, even though they're not the exact same people. I didn't find myself invested in the story, but it's at least a lot different than other games, and Dr. Eggman isn't even the bad guy.
I liked some parts, but really the controls weren't very good, so that's why I didn't like this game overall. It's just so different from a standard control scheme that I think it's really off-putting. That, and I had a hard time figuring out which missions were required for the story and which ones were optional. Also, I didn't want to keep hearing Make-Believe's Reborn in every menu.
Okay, I can't really argue that. I was doing them all as I was going, so it wasn't a problem for me, but I don't think there's a way to tell which ones you need to do to get the true ending to the game. You could just look it up online by now, though.
I don't think this game is great, so I'd be willing to put it low, but if you want to rank it higher, then that's fine, since I don't care enough about this to really argue it.
I think I like it a lot, as it's nice to show the progression of Sonic getting various upgrades and speed to seem like you're really making him better, which isn't common in the series. I'm putting this in B tier.
Okay, now we can get to an actually good Sonic game with Sonic Rush on the Nintendo DS. This featured Blaze the Cat for the first time as an alternate dimension character before she was retconned into being from the future, as her and Sonic are trying to get both the Chaos and Soul Emeralds from Dr. Eggman and Eggman Nega.
Whoa, Donald, you can't say that word here.
No, Joe, he was saying the other bad guy's name, Eggman. It's spelled N-E-G-A not. Anyway, I like this game quite a bit. The gameplay is very fast-paced like it should, and it's generally fun to get through with the two screens acting as one larger level, and it doesn't feel disorienting to switch between both when Sonic or Blaze need to.
Oh yeah, for the first original Sonic game on the DS, it was a really good time, and I even really liked the special stages when those can be pretty hit or miss. It's a much better version of the Sonic 2 ones where you can actually see what's ahead of you way more. Do you think we can put this in B tier? I don't have any real complaints, but there's also nothing in it that I consider to be so great that it deserves S or even A tier.
I suppose so, unless Donald has any major objections.
No, I hadn't really played this too much, and Blaze is cool in the way she plays a little differently from Sonic and even goes through stages in a different order, but it's nothing that I'm too set on defending or criticizing.
All right, good B tier it is then, but now we have to get back to the bad games since Sonic 4 Episode 1 is up. Honestly, I think we can put them both into F tier since they're separate releases, but still so close that they may as well be ranked together. It's literally a mobile phone game rebranded as a mainline Sonic game and is in no way worthy of a follow-up to Sonic 3 and Knuckles. I think F tier is worthy for sure.
I second that it was so disappointing to buy this on the Wii Shop channel only for the second part to never actually come out on that system.
Actually, guys, we can probably wait before putting this in. I won't defend the first episode, but I think the second one is actually good enough to be at least a little bit higher out of F.
I'm not too sure about that. The first episode deserves it due to being very bland in how it uses visuals from previous games, but without any celebratory nature to it like Sonic Generations had. The only thing kind of good was the special stages, since it had you control the stage itself instead of Sonic, so it was at least unique, but it's not enough to save an overall bland game.
Hold on, Barack, maybe Joe is onto something. I'm not going to defend the first one, but now that I think about it, Episode 2 at least makes an effort in giving the game an identity of its own. Sure, most of it was snow and a sky-based level that we've seen before, but Tails being back and giving Sonic team-up moves was nice. It even added episode metal, though it was just a rehash of already rehashed levels, so it wasn't anything special.
I'll agree that Episode 1 should be an F, but I think we can put Episode 2 into D tier since it at least tried harder and deserves something better because of it.
Okay, you've convinced me to put it into D, but not any higher than that.
All right, now let's get to an actually great Sonic game. Even though I wasn't a huge fan of the classic games, I think Sonic Mania is the best classic series type game there is. Easy S tier for sure.
Oh yeah, this is one of my favorite Sonic games of all times. The reimagined levels from Sonic 1, 2, 3, Knuckles, and CD were all improved on, and the new stages like Press Garden, Titanic, Monarch, and Studiopolis were the highlights for me. The only main level I didn't like was Oil Ocean, but even then it was still good.
Honestly, I can't even argue with any of that. It's by far the most well-crafted game in the franchise, especially in the most recent decade, and it's a shame there hasn't been any sequel.
Now, as much as I enjoy this, there are a few minor things that do hinder the game slightly. Not enough to lower my ranking, but still some room for improvement. I didn't find the new Egg Robo-looking characters to be all that interesting, though the boss fights were at least enjoyable. The Mirage Saloon cameos were nice, and the Sonic Chaos boss fight was a strange throwback, though the worst part was the Phantom Ruby causing this game to have a connection to Sonic Forces, and once we rank that game soon, I never want to think about that game again.
Agreed. Probably the best addition to this game is the drop dash, where by holding down the jump button in the air, Sonic will automatically speed up once he hits the ground, which is a simple yet innovating addition to his moveset. The DLC where Mighty and Ray came back after not being playable since Sega Sonic the Hedgehog was neat, though I'm betting most people who enjoy them haven't even played the game before.
Can we just put it in S tier already? I don't think there's any argument to put it somewhere else.
Yeah, it's going in S tier for sure. It's the easiest one for me to recommend to non-Sonic fans. Now let's get on to the most boring game I've ever played. Sonic Forces. This is the one game in the series I can excuse Joe falling asleep in since nothing fun happens in it. Somehow Dr. Overweightman managed to take over nearly the whole world and everybody is useless at taking him down. They all have to rely on Sonic and this avatar, which is just a way to get fan characters like Sonishu in the game, but there's somehow classic Sonic for no real reason.
This was a letdown in every way. Shadow Chaos Zavok and Metal Sonic are all cloned, and yet they're all just copies, and half of them don't even get a boss fight. Probably the worst scene in the whole game is Tails cowering in fear and waiting for Sonic to help him, which completely ruins the character development he's had in the other games before this. Sonic gets tortured for half a year, but it certainly doesn't show based on his dialogue and attitude being exactly the same.
Guys, I know Donald is probably kidding, but I really did fall asleep at this game and only got halfway through the second stage before I decided to do something else.
The main villain is so useless I don't even want to give him the time of day to discuss. The gameplay itself is somehow even less interesting, as most of the game happens on autopilot. You're just boosting through more green hill zone and chemical plant for the most part with no reason behind it that matters. The city levels at least look more unique but aren't any more fun to play. I have no reason to go back and play any of these games. Can you even believe that Sega actually wanted to charge money for Super Sonic as if the game itself is worth paying for?
That is all true, Donald. Personally, I don't want to quite put it in F tier, as the game does at least have some good levels, and some of the vocal songs are the only redeeming parts for a lot of the experience. Granted, I'm not going any higher than D tier, but it's not so bad that I want to put it in F.
I don't know about that. There's just so much wrong here. It's like the game designers went back to good decisions in other games and make them worse just for their own entertainment. You can only collect one wisp for whatever reason in a level, even though there's more than one type you can pick up for the most part. Oh yeah, the wisps are here because why wouldn't they be? I don't agree with D tier, but if it means we move on, then sure, we'll do that.
D tier it is.
Only 2 games left that are on this particular list, and the next one is Sonic Lost World. I'm kind of indifferent to this one as I played both versions, but didn't find either to be all that great. The parkour for both versions kind of confused me on how it worked, and I didn't find it all that fun.
I second that, Joe. I thought it was a fine game either way, but the story was kind of weird. The Deadly Six felt very one-dimensional, and Tails was much worse than he normally is, where he's upset more often than he really should. I don't know why Sega keeps trying to put Zavok into things as if he's a character that deserves to be in a game more than anyone else on the team, and I have no interest in seeing more of the Lost Hex.
I'd say we can just put this into C tier. Some of the game is good as both versions have some nice levels, but it's really trying to be like Mario in the world themes and Super Mario Galaxy specifically when it comes to how Sonic can go around some structures, just like Mario could be walking all around the really small planets. There's nothing I find all that appealing in this game, but nothing that offensive either, except the wisps that show up in every single game for no reason.
I imagine you would have liked the Fat Guy sandwich that is so long it goes off screen.
Yeah, I would have. I would eat it and then hit you with it every time you fail as a president, which is every day.
Okay guys, let's get back to the game. The line about Dr. Eggman wants to strangle Zeddy was really funny, but also didn't really come across as natural for a line in a Sonic game. It's not that remarkable of a game, so we'll do C tier, as it's not really that bad, but not great either.
The last game on the list is Sonic Frontiers. This is definitely a divisive game in the series, but seems to be a pretty popular one more recently. While I do respect what the game tried to do in making a more open world experience, I don't think it went especially well in a lot of areas. The worlds themselves are very fun to explore, but the maps really don't fill up quickly as you have to do tasks around the island to check your surroundings and collectibles. There's also these structures and obstacle courses that have you do some sort of activity, and while these can be fun, it's also just put on the island at almost random, since they quite literally just pop in with no real sense of purpose as to why they're there.
That's a very interesting thought process. Personally, I enjoyed it more, but I see where you're getting at. I found the customization of Sonic's controls and speed to be very fun to experiment with, and made it even better to see what the game has. I will agree the obstacle courses aren't always put in places coherently, but I think the fact that they're usually fun enough makes it fun enough to where their placement issues don't matter quite as much.
That makes sense, but some of them really aren't all that great. Some are just a sidestep to certain lit panels and then you've succeeded, or literally just has Sonic run in a circle to build up speed is too easy. There's also the very generous parry system where if you just hold the buttons down, you'll just float in the air infinitely, though. Since it helps in combat a lot, I won't be too worried.
Oh hey, speaking of combat, I had a lot of fun unlocking new moves. That phantom kicking thing really brought enemies down quickly, and all those titans were a great challenge at times.
Okay, yeah, that was pretty fun, but you want to know what isn't. A required pinball segment that punishes you by losing even one ball, and nobody asked for anything like this to be in a game at all.
Sure, that part was really bad, though I think having that one segment doesn't make it all that bad, since once you're done with it, then you don't have to ever go back. If anything, I'm more bothered by the fact some of the collectibles in the game don't mean all that much and they're really easy to do with Big's fishing minigame, which for some reason comes back, but it's way easier than in Sonic Adventure.
That was a great way of collecting items, so I did like it for that. But yeah, it was a little bit too simple, but I don't want to complain about it being too easy as opposed to too difficult.
Hey, I really liked those mini stages that were throwbacks to older levels in the 3D games, even though the graphics don't really match the originals that much.
And you must have been the only one in the world to like those, as they aren't fun, and I'm glad I didn't have to do them that much.
Hey, I think we should probably acknowledge the DLC that came out, as it added a lot to the experience that makes it better. There were sets of content that were released one at a time and gave new modes which increased the replay value by a bit and had new costumes. I didn't really do much there, but I'm not going to complain about free content.
Honestly, my favorite part of the game was where you could play as Sonic's friends. I had so much fun with going through that one island in a new way and getting to make those cool jumps with Amy, and flying with Tails or Knuckles was the first thing that's exhilarated me since Hunter came by with that powder or whatever that was that the White House staff located.
Yeah, we all know what that powder was, but anyway, it was fun to do that, but you want to know what wasn't fun. Climbing up all those towers as Sonic for minutes on end, while falling down when you make such a small mistake. Truly, however, that pales in comparison to Master King Coco's Trials, where you have to get through 3 boss fights with 400 rings, plus no refilling rings and no checkpoints, where every attempt takes an eternity. I think it was patched to be easier later, but I got it done when there was no easy option and I hated it.
I can't even argue I really like this game, but I cannot defend that awful boss battle series. I did have an enjoyable time when the characters leveled up a lot, as Tails gets his mech from Sonic Adventure 2 again, but it completely breaks all the challenge since he can just fly anywhere with it. At least beating the final boss did change the ending, and now that I think about it, we didn't really talk about the story.
Yeah, I found the story good and all, especially since Ian Flynn wrote it and he made so many great comic stories. My favorite ones when I read them during my younger years were the Ken Penders ones with all those echidnas that he seems to like so much.
This is proof that we need a new president, as nobody who prefers Ken Penders comics should be leading the nation.
Joe, I hate to agree with Donald, but he's right on this one. Your opinion there is straight up whack. Back to the game, it's nice how a lot of callbacks made the characters actually think about their past instead of feeling uninspired like in Sonic Forces. It even referenced Tails being scared like a loser in that game and made it slightly less bad with him learning from it. The dynamic behind Dr. Eggman and Sage was something that was never done before in the series and was nice to see. I'd say overall the game deserves a B tier, as there's a lot that is fun about this game that makes it stand out, though some problems that hold it back.
I suppose I'd agree. I was going to put it lower, but sure, I won't complain about that score.
So is the list done now?
Yes, we're done for now. There are some other games that we could add on to here, but I think that might be more suitable to a second part at some time, since we've already spent quite a while with everything ranked already. If the viewers have any suggestions for ranking more games in this franchise or others, please let us know.
Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
And peace out, people.